Hulk Hogan's ex-wife, Linda Hogan, just broke her silence after the shocking news of Hulk Hogan's death. What she posted on TikTok has fans stunned, and it's changing the narrative. In this juicy video, we break down the bombshell Linda Hogan dropped and how it's sending shockwaves through the wrestling world and for all Hulkamania fans. From never-before-heard revelations to emotional messages, this is the side of the Hogan legacy you haven't seen. The world of professional wrestling stood still. For decades, Hulk Hogan was more than a name, he was a living symbol, a mythic force who carried the very soul of wrestling on his tanned, muscular shoulders. But now, that world was mourning. Hulk Hogan, the man who told millions to say their prayers and eat their vitamins, was gone. And just when the tributes were pouring in from fans, colleagues, and wrestling legends, one unexpected voice shattered the silence: Linda Hogan, his ex-wife. His once life partner. The woman who had stood beside him during his meteoric rise, and later, his darkest collapse. Her sudden TikTok post, raw and unfiltered, was not just a personal message. It was a tremor that sent emotional aftershocks through the heart of the wrestling community. No one was prepared for what she said, because Linda didn't just mourn. She revealed. And in doing so, she cracked open the golden veneer of a legacy that had always seemed larger than life. For the first time, fans saw not the icon in red and yellow, not the immortal Hulkamania warrior, but the vulnerable, complicated man beneath the bandana. The story of Hulk Hogan, it turns out, wasn't just one of glory inside the ring, it was a story of fame, family, betrayal, and the unbearable weight of becoming a living legend. Born Terry Eugene Bollea on August 11, 1953, in Augusta, Georgia, Hogan's journey to stardom wasn't born under spotlights or within championship rings. His beginnings were humble. A young boy raised in Tampa, Florida, Hogan found solace in baseball and music before professional wrestling ever entered the picture. In fact, it was the bass guitar, not a body slam, that first stole his heart. He played in local bands and dreamed of rock stardom. But fate had a different script in mind, one that would rewrite the future of sports entertainment forever. It was in the late 1970s that Hogan began training with Hiro Matsuda, a tough-as-nails Japanese-American wrestler who believed in breaking bones to build discipline. On Hogan's very first day, Matsuda broke his leg, deliberately, to see if he had the guts to return. Hogan did. And that act of defiance would foreshadow the iron will that made him a wrestling legend. By the early 1980s, the man known as Hulk Hogan had begun transforming. Not just physically, with his 24-inch pythons, mustache, and towering frame, but symbolically. He became the face of a new era, and when Vince McMahon's WWF, now WWE, took a gamble and put the company's future on his back, Hogan did what few ever could: he changed the game. He wasn't just a wrestler. He was a phenomenon. With WrestleMania I in 1985, the wrestling world catapulted into the mainstream. Hogan teamed up with Mr. T. Celebrities filled the arena. And millions watched. For the first time, wrestling was not just a fringe sport, it was a cultural juggernaut. And Hulk Hogan was its heartbeat. The birth of Hulkamania swept the globe. His catchphrases became gospel. His red and yellow gear became a symbol of heroism. To children, he was a superhero without a cape. To adults, he was nostalgia wrapped in muscle. Hogan inspired loyalty that bordered on religious. But behind the immortality, behind the pumped-up muscles and the exaggerated promos, was a man, struggling to balance Terry Bollea and Hulk Hogan, and standing beside him during his rise was Linda. The two met in the late 1970s and married in 1983, just as Hogan's star was beginning to ascend. For over 2 decades, Linda Hogan was not only the woman behind the man, but the quiet foundation of his chaotic empire. She stood by him through wrestling booms and industry shifts, through steroid trials and injuries, through tabloid frenzies and a rapidly expanding brand. Together, they had 2 children, Brooke and Nick, and built a lavish life filled with limousines, beachfront mansions, and eventually, a reality show, Hogan Knows Best. But the life the world saw, carefully staged for cameras, wasn't the whole story. As Hogan's fame grew, so did the distance between them. Wrestling was more than a job, it was a lifestyle that consumed him. The constant travel, the physical toll, the media attention, it all took its pound of flesh. And Linda, once the patient partner, began to feel the fractures in their relationship. The early 2000s brought with it a darker chapter. Public scandals, legal battles, and rumors of infidelity began to erode the foundation of their marriage. In 2007, after 24 years of marriage, Linda filed for divorce. It was messy, brutal, and very, very public. Accusations flew. Resentment spilled into courtrooms and onto talk shows. Hogan, reeling from the divorce and a series of controversies, including a leaked tape and comments that sparked public outrage, fell into a spiral. Wrestling fans watched in stunned silence as their childhood hero seemed to crumble in real time, but Linda's voice remained mostly quiet, until now. Her TikTok video, posted just hours after news broke of Hogan's death, was raw, simple, and haunting. She sat in a softly lit room, her face marked by the unmistakable signs of sorrow. There were no flashy graphics, no music, no agenda. Just her. And a truth that had waited nearly 2 decades to be said. "I haven't spoken much over the years," she began, her voice trembling. "But I need to now. Because the world is mourning Hulk Hogan. And I'm mourning Terry." That line alone sent a chill through the wrestling world, because in that moment, Linda reminded us that Hulk Hogan, the character, was only half the story. Terry Bollea, the man, was someone entirely different. And that's who she had loved. That's who she had shared a life with. That's who she had raised children with, laughed with, fought with, and ultimately lost, not just in divorce, but now, forever. Her message wasn't bitter. It wasn't vindictive. It was a reflection. She spoke about the years they shared before the fame overtook everything. She talked about long road trips in the early days, of supporting his dream before there was any spotlight. She mentioned his deep insecurities, how, even at the height of his fame, he was afraid of being forgotten. Afraid of not being good enough. He never really believed he was the hero everyone said he was, she said. He carried that doubt every day. Those words struck a nerve in the hearts of fans who had always viewed Hogan as the embodiment of confidence. The flexing, the booming voice, the wild charisma, it all felt unshakable. But Linda's revelation painted a different portrait, of a man who was haunted by his own shadow. A man who worried the fans would turn on him. Who feared that when the lights went off, so would the love. She spoke, too, of their children, how he adored them. How his biggest regret wasn't a match lost, or a career move missed, it was the time he lost with them in pursuit of being Hulk Hogan 24/7. He was a good father, she whispered. Even when he didn't know how to show it. And then, almost in passing, Linda said something that made every wrestling fan hold their breath. Terry didn't want to die Hulk Hogan, she said. He wanted to die remembered as a man who loved deeply, who made mistakes, but who gave everything, his body, his mind, his heart, to something bigger than himself. For a moment, the noise of the internet stopped. Wrestling forums, Twitter threads, fan pages, every corner of the community was shaken. Because Linda hadn't just honored him, she'd reframed him. In wrestling, heroes and villains are often simple. You cheer one, you boo the other. But Hogan's legacy was always complicated. His rise was meteoric. His fall was painful. His return was controversial. But what Linda offered was a final chapter that no one had seen coming, a moment of peace. A moment of clarity. A look behind the mask. Wrestling legends began reposting the clip. Ric Flair tweeted, "Linda's words were beautiful. Terry was one of a kind. We all wore the business on our backs because of him." Mick Foley posted, "This is the most human I've ever seen Hulk Hogan. Thank you, Linda, for sharing him with us one last time." The narrative had shifted. Not just because Hogan was gone, but because his story was now being told by someone who had loved him when no cameras were rolling. Someone who had seen him without the sunglasses and spotlight. Someone who had seen him cry. It's easy to forget that before there was WWE as we know it, before WrestleMania-filled stadiums, before global streaming deals and billion-dollar valuations, there was a time when wrestling was just a regional act, a sideshow for the passionate few. It took a singular force to elevate it into pop culture's main stage. That force was Hulk Hogan. He took body slams and turned them into theater. He took promos and turned them into war cries. He made wrestling cool, at a time when people were ashamed to admit they watched it. And he did it by becoming larger than life. But the cost of being a god in the ring was forgetting how to be a man outside of it. Linda Hogan's message, in just under 3 minutes, reminded the world that underneath every legacy is a person. A father. A husband. A dreamer. A man trying to be better than the worst of his mistakes. And for all the headlines that have followed Hogan over the years, for all the controversies, the lawsuits, the estrangements, there is something hauntingly beautiful in the idea that, at the end, he was still loved. Still remembered. Still forgiven, not as Hulk Hogan but as Terry. And now, as fans around the world replay old matches, shout "Whatcha gonna do, brother," one more time, and wear red and yellow in tribute, they're doing so with a deeper understanding of the price of fame, of the fragility of legends, of the fact that even the biggest heroes sometimes don't see themselves that way. Linda's words gave us a final gift. They gave us truth. And in that truth, the story of Hulk Hogan didn't end in controversy or chaos, it ended with humanity. The reaction to Linda Hogan's heartfelt video rippled far beyond the wrestling world. News outlets that had once painted their divorce with salacious brushstrokes were now reframing the narrative. Commentators once eager to exploit the Hogan family's personal struggles were now revisiting his legacy through a more compassionate lens. What Linda offered wasn't just an emotional farewell, it was a reckoning. A reshaping of how we remember one of wrestling's most polarizing yet transformative figures. Hulk Hogan's legacy, complicated as it may be, is inseparable from the rise of modern professional wrestling. Without Hogan, there is no WrestleMania as we know it. There is no crossover success of WWE superstars into mainstream media. There is no golden age of wrestling. He was the blueprint. He made wrestling a household name and gave the business a face that even your grandparents could recognize. And even though his later years would be clouded by scandal, lawsuits, and criticism, his early impact was undeniable. It was Hogan who first turned the WWF into a global empire. His matches drew millions. His rivalries, especially with the likes of Andre the Giant, Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior, were the stuff of legend. He was the constant face of Saturday morning television, action figures, and cereal boxes. He wasn't just a wrestler. He was a brand. And that brand made Vince McMahon's vision of a wrestling titan into reality. But with great fame comes greater shadows. Hogan's life outside the ring became a tabloid-feeding frenzy in the 2000s. The reality show Hogan Knows Best was intended to showcase a loving, all-American family. But instead, it exposed cracks, tensions between Linda and Hulk, pressures on their children, and a creeping sense that the red and yellow dream wasn't what it once was. Eventually, those cracks split open. Linda filed for divorce in 2007, citing infidelity. She claimed that Hogan's attention had strayed, that the man she once knew had become consumed by the very character he had created. The divorce became ugly. Public accusations, property battles, interviews aired with thinly veiled resentment. Linda, who had once supported Hogan at every arena and stood beside him during his battles with the media, became estranged not just from her husband, but from much of the wrestling world. She was painted in the press as bitter, opportunistic. Even their children were caught in the crossfire, with their daughter Brooke later revealing how traumatic the public unraveling of her family had been. Hogan, for his part, seemed to tumble into a period of instability. He faced backlash for controversial comments leaked in a private tape, comments that saw him temporarily erased from WWE's history books. It was the lowest point in a career that had once defined an era. And through it all, Linda remained silent. Until now, her video didn't dwell on the bitterness. She didn't rehash court battles or scandals. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She showed the human being behind the bandana. She spoke not just of the Hulk Hogan the world had known, but of Terry, the man who struggled with the fame he created. The man who didn't always know how to express love, but tried in his own flawed ways. He always wanted people to cheer, Linda said, her voice cracking. Even at home, even with us, he needed that applause. Not out of arrogance, but because he never felt worthy without it. That revelation opened a floodgate of conversations within the wrestling community. Because it spoke to a deeper truth about the cost of building an icon. Hulk Hogan wasn't just a wrestling persona, it was a mask. A shield. A performance that never ended. And perhaps, in the process of becoming that larger-than-life character, Terry Bollea got lost. Wrestling historians began revisiting the early days of Hogan's career. They wrote op-eds, dissected promos, and re-examined matches, not to glorify or vilify him, but to understand him. To piece together how a man from humble beginnings could ascend to the highest peaks of pop culture, and then fall just as fast. Linda's words acted like a key, unlocking memories that had long been buried. She spoke of his anxiety, his obsession with physical perfection, the toll of the spotlight on his mental health. How he would sometimes pace the house before a big media appearance, muttering promos to himself under his breath, trying to psych himself up. He wasn't just hyping the fans, she said. He was hyping himself. Because underneath all that bravado, he was scared. Scared of being forgotten. Scared of losing everything. It was a sobering reminder that even legends bleed, but it wasn't all sadness. Linda also shared memories of joy. Of early mornings watching cartoons with their kids. Of beach days when Hogan would bury himself in the sand just to make the kids laugh. Of how he always made sure to call her before every big match, just to hear her voice. Even when their marriage was on the rocks. He never stopped caring, she said. Even when we didn't understand each other anymore. The video concluded with Linda placing a hand over her heart, tears streaming down her face. He was flawed, she said. But he was real. And now he's gone. And I just want the world to remember him as I do, not just as Hulk Hogan, but as the man who dreamed bigger than anyone, who fought with everything he had, and who, even in his darkest moments, never gave up. That ending broke the internet. TikTok users flooded the comments with condolences. Wrestling fans reposted the video on every platform. Even news outlets that had once ridiculed the Hogan divorce began quoting Linda's speech with reverence. Because she had done what no one else could do, she brought peace to a divided legacy. In the days that followed, WWE released an official tribute video, and to everyone's surprise, it included a direct quote from Linda's message. A moment of grace. A moment of healing. Perhaps even an acknowledgement that, despite everything, her voice still mattered in the story of the man who helped build the empire. For younger fans, this moment served as a history lesson. For older fans, it was a tearful trip down memory lane. But for everyone watching, it was a reminder that behind the ring entrances and title belts are real lives. Real stories. And sometimes, the most powerful moments don't happen under the spotlight, but after it fades. Hulk Hogan is gone. But his story is far from over. Because now, the people who truly knew him are finally speaking. And their voices are painting a legacy richer, deeper, and more heartbreakingly human than anyone ever imagined, and maybe that's the real tribute. In the weeks that followed Hulk Hogan's passing and Linda Hogan's emotional post, the world began revisiting not just the career of a wrestling icon, but the story of a complicated man who had shaped, and been shaped by, an industry addicted to spectacle. For the wrestling world, Hogan was a cornerstone. A foundation upon which a global phenomenon was built. Without Hulk Hogan, the World Wrestling Federation might have remained a niche, regional curiosity. With him, it became a titan of entertainment. He was the lightning rod that drew millions of new fans, the merchandising juggernaut who helped sell out arenas, lunchboxes, and Saturday morning cartoons. He didn't just put WWE on the map, he was the map. Yet, even now, as fans and friends paid their final respects, there was something about Linda's message that changed the way people remembered him. She had cut through the noise. Through the headlines. Through the controversies. Through the showbiz. She had reached Terry, and by doing so, gave permission for the rest of the world to remember him not just as a superhero, but as a man. broken, passionate, vulnerable, generous, explosive. Human, and that humanity wasn't always pretty. Hogan's later years were punctuated by a mix of comebacks and collapses. After the WCW folded, he returned to WWE in 2002 to one of the loudest ovations in wrestling history. The fans had not forgotten. And neither had Vince McMahon, who gave him the platform for one last run, complete with a match against The Rock that would become a generational moment. But beneath the roar of the crowd, the real man was fighting his own demons. His body was ravaged by decades of leg drops, surgeries piled up like trophies, and behind the smile was a growing sense of isolation. When the reality show Hogan Knows Best debuted in 2005, it seemed like a way for him to stay connected to fans. But it only exposed more of what fame had eroded. The show chronicled his attempts to maintain control over his daughter Brooke's burgeoning music career, his struggles with aging, and the strain on his marriage with Linda. What was meant to be a celebration of the Hogan family soon became a front-row seat to its implosion, and when the divorce was finalized, it was one of the most high-profile splits in celebrity culture at the time. Linda walked away with a large portion of their assets. Hogan, in interviews afterward, spoke of betrayal and financial devastation. He felt like he had lost everything, not just his money, but his identity. But what few people knew then, and what Linda's video revealed now, was that Hogan's sense of loss went much deeper. He missed his family, Linda had said. Even when he said otherwise on TV, or in interviews. He never stopped missing it. Those words hit like a body slam to the heart. Because it reframed years of sound bites and headlines. Maybe those explosive interviews Hogan gave during the divorce weren't just bitterness. Maybe they were grief. Maybe he wasn't trying to burn bridges, maybe he was trying to shout across them, even if the words came out wrong. And maybe, all along, Hulk Hogan wasn't trying to live up to the myth. Maybe he was trying to outrun it. The myth of Hulk Hogan is immortal. The leg drop. The Hulk up. The ripped shirt. The finger point to the heavens. It lives in the minds of generations. He was the reason so many kids became wrestling fans. The reason arenas sold out. The reason the word WrestleMania exists in our cultural vocabulary. But Terry Bollea, the man beneath the handlebar mustache, was mortal. Flawed. Struggling to find meaning in a world that only seemed to love the mask he wore. When Linda chose to speak, she didn't ask for pity. She didn't ask for attention. She offered closure. Not just for herself, not just for their children, but for the millions of people who had watched their family fall apart in public and never knew the full story. And perhaps more powerfully, she offered forgiveness. There were years we didn't speak, she said quietly in the video. But I forgave him. Long before this happened. I had to. Because I knew, he wasn't perfect. But he was doing his best with the tools he had. And in those few sentences, she gave the wrestling world permission to forgive the mistakes. The scandals. The words he wished he could take back. Because no one becomes the face of an empire without getting scarred along the way. Hulk Hogan bore the weight of an entire industry, and in many ways, it crushed him, but he carried it anyway. He carried it when Vince McMahon needed someone to anchor a risky event called WrestleMania. He carried it when fans needed a hero in the 80s to cheer for. He carried it when wrestling was falling into obscurity and needed a savior in the form of the Red and Yellow Storm. And even as his body broke down, as surgeries racked up, as friends drifted and public favor faded, he kept carrying it. Because he didn't know how to stop. In the days after Linda's video, tributes began to deepen. Fans didn't just post highlight reels. They started sharing personal stories. Videos of children meeting Hogan at fan expos. Stories of Hogan visiting hospitals unannounced. Moments backstage when he comforted a nervous rookie. Those memories weren't about the icon, they were about the man. Brooke Hogan, his daughter, also posted a message. In it, she thanked her mother. You said what needed to be said, Brooke wrote. You showed the world the dad I remember. Not the headlines. Not the promos. But the dad who made us pancakes at 6 a.m. and told us bedtime stories about dragons who never gave up. The dragon, it seemed, was gone, but the legacy he left behind. Hulkamania, yes, but also the complicated trail of love and loss, was richer now, more complete. In the end, Hogan didn't just shape wrestling. He embodied everything that made it thrilling, and everything that made it tragic. The bright lights. The broken homes. The roar of the crowd. The silence afterward. The victories. The betrayals. The adoration. The regret. Linda Hogan, in under 3 minutes, gave the world a final match. Not in the ring, but in the heart. She allowed Hogan to step out of character. To remove the shades, the bravado, the catchphrases, and to be seen as a man trying, failing, healing, and trying again. Not every hero gets a perfect ending, but thanks to Linda, Hulk Hogan got something far more real. A goodbye. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of Linda Hogan's TikTok did not slow down, they intensified. Wrestling podcasts, news outlets, and even late-night talk shows reflected on her words. Some offered commentary, others played clips, but the consensus was clear: Linda Hogan had reshaped the farewell narrative of one of the most iconic figures in sports entertainment history, because for decades, Hulk Hogan was untouchable. Not just in the ring, where he vanquished giants and villains with his immortal leg drop, but in the mythos of wrestling itself. He was the origin point for many fans. Their first memory of wrestling? Likely Hogan ripping his shirt, the American flag waving behind him, and the deafening sound of a sold-out arena screaming his name. He was hope, power, and Americana rolled into one larger-than-life persona. But over time, myths begin to show their cracks. And when the curtain is pulled back, what's left is often more painful, and more meaningful, than the fantasy. Linda's post pulled that curtain back. Not to ruin the legend, but to remind us that the legend was built by a man. A father. A husband. A man who struggled. Who failed. Who tried. And in that truth, Hulk Hogan's story became more powerful than ever. One of the most heartbreaking moments Linda shared came near the end of her video. Her voice trembling, she said, "Terry always wanted to be remembered. He worried that once the lights went off, once the fans moved on, he'd just disappear. That all of it, everything he gave, would fade." It's a sentiment that echoes across the world of pro wrestling. So many performers give their bodies, their minds, their marriages, their very identities, to the business. And when the fame fades, what's left? For some, nothing. But for Hogan, as Linda reminded the world, what was left was family, memory, and the fight to be more than the character he created. In the days after Hogan's death, WWE announced a tribute episode of SmackDown dedicated to his memory. The stage was bathed in red and yellow. The Titantron played his entrance theme, Real American, while generations of superstars stood on the ramp with bowed heads. And in the middle of the ring was an empty pair of yellow boots, a red bandana, and a spotlight that seemed to pierce through the decades. But even then, it was Linda's voice, recorded, replayed, and remembered, that lingered. Fans had heard from The Rock, from Ric Flair, from John Cena. But it was Linda Hogan, the woman who saw him rise, fall, and rise again, who gave them something they didn't expect. Closure. In a special interview with People magazine just days after her video went viral, Linda expanded on what prompted her to finally speak. "I wasn't planning on saying anything," she admitted. "It was personal. But then I saw how people were remembering him, some with love, some with anger, some with confusion. And I thought, maybe I can help them see the whole picture. Maybe I can say what he never could." She paused, and then added, "He was never great at saying sorry. But he was always trying to be better." That was Terry. That image, that version of Hulk Hogan, resonated more deeply than any promo ever could. Because while fans will always remember the showman, it's the man Linda described, the one who tried, who broke, who got up again, that truly embodies the spirit of wrestling. There's something poetic about the fact that Hogan's final legacy wasn't scripted in a ring. It wasn't a storyline. It wasn't a farewell match or a Hall of Fame speech. It was a quiet confession, a vulnerable tribute, from the one person who knew him long before the world did. Wrestling, at its core, is about stories. Good versus evil. Triumph over adversity. Pain, redemption, glory. And in the end, Linda Hogan gave us the final chapter in Hulk Hogan's story. One that had no titles, no belts, no main events, just truth, and maybe that's what fans needed most. Not another highlight reel. Not another catchphrase. But permission to see Hulk Hogan not as a perfect hero, but as a flawed one. A real one. Because real heroes aren't defined by never falling. They're defined by how many times they get back up. And in every way that mattered, Hulk Hogan kept getting up, even when it hurt. Even when the world turned on him. Even when the cheers faded. He kept going. And in doing so, he gave everything he had to the world of wrestling. Now, as tributes continue to pour in, as red and yellow lights